Whoa, 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 whoa. I got another one of them doctor type people on my channel. Oh my God, I wish all that education would rub off on me and I could get my doctorate. Oh my God, man. They got me reading more and everything because I'm all interested in what they're talking about. They giving all this good, I'm not going to say just Black history, I'm going to say American history because it's really the same. It's all interwoven because it happened in America. And it wasn't just Black people that it was happening to. It was some everybody that was making this all happen and really formulating the country in the form that they did. That's all I got. That's a little commentary because I'm starting out the day saying something. And the other thing I want to say to you, my friends, I appreciate you watching my channel. And I know some of you are watching it every video, but let me ask you to do a favor, subscribe. Hit the subscribe button. It's free. And it's at the bottom of the screen, or when it gets up on the YouTube, hit the subscribe button. Like this video, because she's ready. She's smiling. She said, I'm ready to go. I got stuff to tell you. Hit the notifications bell because you get a ding or something like that, but at least you get notified that I've uploaded a new video. And if you can tell, I'm doing 3, 4, 5 videos a week. So hit the notifications video, and then also don't keep it to yourself. Tell somebody about Strong Inspirations. Yeah, share this with some younger people, some older people, some of your people, so that they can know and be enlightened as this is what we do here on the channel. We enlighten you. And as you might know, I got a movie out. I'm a filmmaker. So I don't just do this. I've made a couple movies, and this is one of them. It's called Business in the Black, The Rise of Black Business in America. It's 75 minutes of amazing, powerful information that a lot of it we talk about on the channel. And it's streaming on Amazon. So if you don't have a DVD player, you can just watch it on your cell phone, your laptop, wherever, streaming on your TV, wherever it is. It's called Business in the Black. And I had so much fun doing that I wrote a book. And my book is titled Black Business Book. And they really kind of go hand in hand. The documentary has interviews with people whose family owned a business in the early 1900s. The book doesn't have that, but the book just got all these facts. It's like it's really 204 facts in total. The first fact is 1619, when the first slaves got here. The last fact is about Motown Records, because I stopped at 1960 and Motown was started in 59. It's gonna blow you away. It's so much so that if you read the book and you don't learn anything new, I give you money back. All right. It's on Amazon also. And it's also, if you want to cut the Amazon guy out, because he got enough money, you know what I mean? I need help. Go to my website, inspirationsbystrong.com, because everything I do is strong. I like that word. Oh, you can say strong with everything. And I'm going to say it right now. The lady that's about to introduce herself in the next hit is a strong lady coming at you strong. So go ahead and tell us your name and a little bit about yourself.
Well, that's probably my favorite introduction ever.
Oh,
so
thank you.
I am Amy Merle Taylor. I am a historian at the University of Kentucky, where I teach courses on American history, the history of the South, Civil War and Reconstruction. And I published a book called Embattled Freedom, Journeys Through the Civil War Slave Refugee Camps. So thank you for having me.
So now tell us a little about yourself. How did you want to learn history and let that be what you do every day?
Yeah, I kind of stumbled into it a little bit. I went to college as a math major.
Oh.
I just liked math. And I thought that's how my mind worked. But I was in college, and on a lark, I saw a course called The History of American Women. And this was in the early 90s. And I was like, what? There's a whole course on the history of women? They have a history?
Yeah.
And I took it, and it just opened my eyes to the way in which the way I'd been taught history had left so many people out. so much of the story out. And I just
Sure.
got hooked to kind of become a detective and start digging and telling a much more fuller story of the American past.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, well, are you teaching every semester? Is there something new slant that you do to it at times because you've learned something new? How does that go to make it
Oh,
even interesting for yourself?
oh, all the time. In fact, I like to teach courses sometimes that are on a subject I want to learn more about, and I'm kind of learning along with the students. So for example, right now I'm teaching a course for graduate students on the history of Reconstruction, which I know a lot about, but there's also a lot I realize I still need to learn. And so we're kind
Yeah.
of doing it all together. I feel like there's so much history to learn that you could always investigate something new.
How do you do research? How does that start? Let's say.
Okay, so any of my research in book for
Yes.
books or
Yeah.
anything.
Whatever it is. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, it starts with a nagging question, something that I just need to know. And, that's where it starts. And then I really do compare it to detective work, even though I've never been a detective.
Sure.
So then I take that question and I try to figure out where is the evidence? Where are the people, the documentation, where are the facts, as you say? Where am I going to find them? And usually that leads me to some kind of archive. I've spent a lot of time at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., looking at old papers written in the 1860s. In the case of my latest book, kept by the Army, and just start digging and, like a detective, putting together little fragments of evidence and trying to figure out what the story was.
Really? So now, there's actually, I'm learning this more. Is that there are actual documents, the original documents somewhere in the National Archives or what have you.
Yes, and the National Archives is open to the public. So this is not, you
Okay.
don't have to be some like professional historian with a special ID card or anything.
Yeah.
It's all open to the public, and the Library of Congress is the same way. And you can go, there's a bureaucratic process of filling
Sure.
out forms and stuff, but you
Sure.
can go and view and touch, have right on the desk in front of you documents that, in the case of what I studied, people coming out of slavery, formerly enslaved people, signed with an X, or
Really.
Lincoln signed with his name. Yeah, I mean, because these belong to all of us.
So my last question on this thing, because you kind of got me to thinking because when I was doing my book, everybody, I went to the Library of Congress in Washington D.C. and did a little research, but I didn't see any original. I didn't go as far as original documents, and I really could have done that just at home on my computer.
You mean finding documents?
Yeah, well, not finding, but finding the information that I found when I went there, because it's all usually online. It's in digital format
Well,
now.
and we are experiencing this great digital revolution since I
Yeah.
started becoming a historian. There is so much that's available online now, and you can see the image of the original, but I kind of feel like there's nothing like going and actually touching it.
Okay.
That you
Sure.
can't do online.
Yeah.
And that's what's really
Now, do they make you sign some paperwork because it's so valuable to some of the documents? How do you have to sit at a desk right there in front of them? I'm sure because.
Oh yeah, I mean, they're kind of watching you, and
Yeah.
they inspect your bag when you walk out to make sure you're not taking any with you.
Sure.
So,
Sure.
because these are they belong to all of us. Nobody can just take it for themselves.
Yeah. Sure.
So yeah.
Yeah, I got you. Now, so this leads into your book. What is the title of your book? What is your area that you wrote in?
Okay, so I am a historian of the Civil War and Emancipation, and I wrote a book called Embattled Freedom: Journeys Through the Civil War Slave Refugee Camps,
Okay.
which is a story essentially of how slavery was destroyed during this war.
How it was
And
what now?
destroyed, broken down,
Destroyed.
abolished. And that history very often is told as a history of Lincoln. He sat down, he issued his Emancipation Proclamation, and suddenly everybody was free. But that's a story that just captures a little glimmer of the whole picture.
Yeah, sure.
There's a much bigger story of what enslaved people themselves did. And what they did was they, from the very first days of the war, started fleeing slavery and making their way into the lines of the Union Army and forcing the question of emancipation on Lincoln and on the Union Army. And they arguably are the ones who emancipated themselves.
Really? Okay, that's
Yeah.
interesting. Now, I had posted something that when did he sign the Emancipation Proclamation?
So it went into effect January 1st, 1863.
Right.
Yeah, that's
But he signed it prior to that, like in October or something like that?
Well, he issued what was called a preliminary draft, essentially, of the proclamation. And that was in September. That was late September. And then it was January 1st when the final draft went into effect.
Did he himself maybe write this? Or, I mean, he had other people helping, but he kind of wrote it?
Oh, yeah. Oh, he did. And, if you read it, it's not that long. It's not, we associate Lincoln with this like soaring rhetoric. He was really good with words. The proclamation reads like a military order. It's very straightforward and just outlines how this is going to work.
Yeah. So I guess to sum it up, does it say something like, okay, when we win a battle, those people, the slaves in that area are free, and that's it? I mean, what's the other dynamics of it, man?
The key thing was, he says that those in areas still in rebellion against the Union would be considered forever free. But then what he outlines are then places where enslaved people were not living in a region that was in rebellion. And he says these are exempt. This proclamation does not affect them. So Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, Delaware, Tennessee, and some parts of Louisiana and Virginia were all exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation.
That's because they weren't talking about seceding from the government.
Right. The 4 border states had never seceded. And then the other regions, Tennessee and parts of Louisiana and Virginia, by this point in the war, the Union occupied those areas. And so they were kind of back in the Union. They weren't really in rebellion anymore.
Oh, so when they say seceded, what did they do? If you may answer this, what did they do to say they had succeeded? They stopped paying taxes to the federal government, or what was that line of saying, okay, we're not with you no more?
Yeah, usually it happened. They held a convention in their state, and it was, the white political leaders came together, held a convention, and then they would issue an ordinance. They issued this sort of proclamation, like, we are now seceded. One of the first things they did was try to get the Union Army, which had military installations around the South, they would try to push the Union Army out, and they took back some of those installations. That was one of the first things that they did. And then they started forming their own government. They withdrew their members of Congress and the Senate.
Oh, did they? Okay. Okay.
I mean, there are a couple cases where people stayed, but generally they pulled back out and they formed their own Congress. They elected their own president, created their own constitution. So really try to do a lot of the things we associate with building a new nation.
Really? Mm-hmm. And so just that alone didn't sound right to the Northerners.
No.
I mean, you're here on our land. You're not going to be separate from us, and then maybe, heaven forbid, one day we have to fight you in some kind of war, even after the Civil War or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, they saw this as completely illegitimate and illegal. They said this is destroying the nation. And, because the South, these Southern states, when they're seceding, they're arguing that they have a constitutional right to do so, that the US Constitution gives them a right to, reject the federal government when it seems to be overstepping its bounds, which is what they argued. And the northern politicians said, no, secession is not legitimate. You can't do this. This is illegitimate. So we're going to, fight back, and we're going to pull you back into the Union.
So as we move along, when the slaves found out that there was a war, how did they find out there was going to be a war? Did they kind of know sometime earlier? They heard through the grapevine things were beginning to take a shape.
So enslaved people, let's say the conflict before the war starts, it starts years before the war, but really heats up in the 1850s. Enslaved people know what's going on the whole time. They, yes, word traveled on the grapevine among them, but many enslaved people are in places where they hear what's going on. They're in cities, they're in households, they know what's happening. And they're aware of abolitionism in the North. They're aware of what these Southern states have done. They're aware of Lincoln's election right before the war starts, the event that really triggers the secession of the South. They're aware of this, and they're aware that Lincoln holds the promise of ending slavery. They are aware that
does he say this as a campaign pledge or something like that?
So, well, early years before he ran for president, he did publicly declare slavery to be morally wrong. I mean, he did express a lot of misgivings about it. During his campaign, though, he struck a more moderate position. And he basically wanted to stop the expansion of slavery into the new Western territories, but he promised to leave slavery alone where it already existed in the South. But enslaved people, interestingly, still saw something in his election. And so what happens is, to get closer to your question, when the war breaks out in April 1861, from just days afterwards, enslaved people start fleeing.
They start what?
Fleeing.
Fleeing, okay.
They start leaving their plantations, and they're bringing their children with them, and they're going into the lines of the Union Army, and they start offering their labor to the Union, and making the argument, if you allow us to work for you, that's going to help defeat the Confederacy.
Okay, let me stop you there then. Okay, yeah. Now they're fleeing. Isn't there enslaver trying to stop him from fleeing, or he's got bigger problems to worry about?
Yeah, well, both, actually. Yeah, sure. Actually, this is a really big problem for him, and they often try to stop. But what happens is they tend to flee in places where their enslavers are experiencing a lot of upheaval from the war. So places where the Union Army is around, and I'll take the coast of Virginia as an example, because this is really the first place where it happens. What happens along the coast of Virginia, the Union is there at Fort Monroe, and the Union starts building up its military presence there. And so a lot of slave owners along the coast start fleeing inland to Richmond.
So they're fleeing even before the war starts.
Sometimes the enslavers fled first. Yeah. And they try to take enslaved people, they try to take them with them, or they try to send them off to the Confederate Army to be laborers or something. But in that sort of upheaval, it actually provides a bit of an opening and a little bit of space for enslaved people to then flee to the other direction.
Now, the enslavers, what's their take on this? At that point, what is their mindset? They're thinking, I got to really believe in slavery so hard that I'm willing to give my life for it.
Yeah, they do. They believe in it so hard because and I think some of my students come into class assuming that slavery for white slave owners was just economic, that it was just, they had an investment in it, so they had to protect that. But it's much more than that. It's their social status, it's their racial status, their political status. Everything is wrapped up with the privilege that slavery gives them. And so they're fighting for their livelihood. They're fighting for everything when they're defending slavery.
So when you say their political status and things like that, because the more slaves you have, the more you revered among your contemporaries, or why do you say that then, what you just said?
Yeah, well, it works in various ways politically. Right. On the one hand, slavery elevates white people into a position of status and sort of protects them in this privileged status where really they're the only people viewed, at least by the Supreme Court, as citizens, and therefore eligible to participate in the political process and the political system.
Because you own slaves.
Yeah, but slavery also kind of creates this clear racial divide between white and Black, and determines that Black is unfree and without rights, white is free and with citizenship rights.
Can you be an enslaver and have a conscious about yourself or what you're doing, and you only do it for the economic situation, and you're a little more liberal to your slaves? Is that? I'm sure there's all dynamics, but that could be possible, right?
Well, yes. I mean, there are all different gradations of this, and we do have examples of enslavers who express some ambivalence about slavery, and but then are not sure what would happen if we just suddenly ended it overnight. And that is an economic question, but oftentimes it's not just economic to them. Some of them might have misgivings about slavery, but they don't have misgivings about inequality. And
Okay.
so they can't imagine a pro-slavery world. If we
Really?
end it, slavery is wrong, but if we end it, how are Black and white people going to live together in this country? They can't wrap their minds around that.
I
And so
see.
some of
I
those
see.
people, some of those people are the ones who advocate what was called colonization. Let's send, newly freed people out of the country to go live in, Liberia and Africa or Haiti or some other place, basically remove them from the country. So,
Oh,
I mean, yes, there are some people with a conscience, but even, their conscience doesn't necessarily lead them to envision a
yeah.
society of racial equality either.
How do again? So now the emancipation is signed. He signs it in the federal government, White House, and does it take effect immediately that day, or is there some grace period? How does that time
So
thing go?
it's immediate on January 1st. It's immediate in the areas that are included, so that are in rebellion. But as I think you were pointing out, how does that work when some Confederate out there is not going to just say, okay, Lincoln says,
Right.
they're free, I better let them go. They're not going to. So the Union Army has to get into these regions, has to go deep into the South, and bring the word, not
Yeah.
just bring the word of freedom, but bring the guns and bring the force that's going to
Yeah.
enforce this proclamation. So it doesn't, nobody achieves their freedom overnight.
Yeah.
And I think
Sure.
that's one of the sort of vague myths that we kind of have that come out of the proclamation. We think that overnight everybody was free, and it was a process. It didn't
Yeah.
work that way.
It was really based on winning the battles of the war, I guess, at
Yeah,
some point, and so on and
exactly.
so forth. And so,
Exactly.
do the enslavers say God has answered our cries?
The,
Um,
the
is
enslaver.
there, yeah, the enslaved,
Oh, the
black people.
enslaved.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
What's their take?
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. Many do view it that way and view this as they're sort of living out the Exodus story in the Old Testament, that here comes our moment. And now the journey to the promised land begins. And this becomes actually an important biblical story to the people I write about in my book, because I'm writing about the people who are fleeing to Union lines from that very first day of the war, before and after the proclamation. And they start living it's a hard life to flee during a war and to go live with an army. I mean, that's incredibly risky and dangerous, but
Why is that? Why is that? Why is that? Why is that?
well, I mean, first of all, wherever the Union Army is, there tends to be active combat and fighting. So it's just dangerous. There's
So you
physical.
running through the bullets and so on and so forth, and you're high. Okay.
Sure. There's that. And then you're going to an army where, despite the fact that the commander in chief, Lincoln, is getting on board with emancipation, not everybody in that army, not everybody even in the command structure is fully on board with this.
Okay.
So they're encountering an army that's ambivalent about their presence there and is not doing some of the things that is being ordered that they do, which is provide shelter, provide food rations. So as a result, those who are fleeing into Union Army lines, they encounter the racism of Union officials. Sometimes they encounter, a lack of housing. They've got to really, they're really desperate for good shelter, to feed themselves. All the while, disease is running rampant. That was just a truism of army camps during the war. So it's
Oh
just very
man. Okay.
dangerous on a number of levels.
Yeah, sure. Do you see instances of where the enslavers say, okay, well, I'm losing, and he just goes out and he kills his slaves in rebellion or just madness or something like that?
To in retaliation for running off or something?
Yeah, not just running off just because, hey, I got a feeling I'm losing and
Yeah.
I'm blaming you for my loss. You know how people do that.
Absolutely. There is a lot of violent retaliation
Against the slaves.
Against the slaves,
Right.
on the part of the enslaver. And one of the most common instances of this that I found are sometimes the people who ran off first might be a man, a man from a slave community. And it's a little bit complicated, but this is more in some of those border states that happen more often.
Sure.
And the idea was that if he had a wife and children and family, they would follow later. Well, sometimes what happened was they became the target of the violence of the enslaver, who's so angry that that man ran off and left. And so there's some really, really heart-wrenching, horrible cases of women who become the brunt or who absorb the brunt of the violence, as a way to, in some ways, it's taking his anger out on her, but it's also sending a message to that man, because sometimes they're getting word of what's happening at home. Yeah. And sending a message to him, look what's happening.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you see instances of some slaves fighting on behalf of the Confederacy?
No.
You know how he's just so brainwashed or something like that? Or, hey, man, you better shoot.
That's a myth that I have a friend who's written a book that does a great job of really doing the research to take this myth apart. Kevin Levin's Searching for Black Confederates. What I have seen are enslaved people who are forced to labor for the Confederate Army. While they haven't gotten free yet. And so they're now being, moved from plantations to the Confederate Army's camps to work. And they show up in photographs sometimes, and sometimes people, they misinterpret this as somebody who was voluntarily there, but they're not.
Yeah, sure. So it's they're not brainwashed that hard at all to think that, hey, okay, I like being slave better than otherwise, because I know what my conditions will be or something like that.
I mean, the very fact, I and other colleagues have estimated that about 500,000 people fled from slavery to the Union Army during the war. That's like 1/8 of the slave population.
So 500,000 is 1/8, so that's 4.5 million enslaved people, something like that.
Yeah, it's actually around 4, but I sort of rounded up a little. But yeah, I mean, that's a big, and many millions of others just weren't in proximity to the Union Army. They just couldn't get there. But I think the fact that they do this and they do this risky, dangerous things just tells you like how much, of course, they wanted to be free. And of course they were willing to take risks in order to get it. So this whole idea of being brainwashed to be pro-Southern just doesn't hold water.
Do you see instances again where there's where slaves came together, there's a big party or there's a burning of enslaved? Do the enslaved people, once they come in, do they burn the house of the master in jubilation? Is there any of those instances?
I haven't seen that so much. I mean, the people I write about tended to leave their plantation, so they were just getting out. They were just leaving it behind. But I do see celebration, and interesting, back to where we started, even though the Emancipation Proclamation did not free everybody and was really only kind of the beginning of a process, each year on its anniversary for the final 2 years of the war, and then after the war, large communities of Black people came together around these Union Army camps to hold celebrations of the proclamation. Because it just, even though maybe it didn't free everybody, it was a really important symbol that if the Union won this war, if the United States won this war, freedom would be permanent. And so it still was a really important moment to sort of stop. On the coast of Virginia that I was describing, I mean, they had celebrations a year after with, thousands of people gathered. Black soldiers were marching, musicians are playing, they're singing.
Really?
Yeah. Okay. So it was a pretty big celebration. These became the beginnings of Emancipation Day celebrations or, Juneteenth celebrations.
Yeah, I was kind of going into that just a little bit. So then the word gets, Texas is where the word gets there the latest, for a better way of putting it, right?
Uh-huh. Yeah. So, and there was probably some word before, but there was a big moment in June 1865. So a couple months after the war ended back in the East, when official word through the Army channels comes and the Army officer sort of delivers this message. So that was a pretty big moment.
Yeah, and that's our Juneteenth celebration.
Right. And what's interesting is that, to me, is how that day is celebrated as Juneteenth. And then there are other days and other places that are celebrated as Emancipation Days. Like some celebrate, Watch Night on January 1st.
What is that? What is Watch Night?
So Watch Night goes back to December 31st, 1862, the day before the proclamation was to go into effect. And what we saw were African-American people, some of them in the North too, who were gathering in churches on the 31st, waiting till midnight, waiting for word to come through, the telegraph and the, news channels that Lincoln had kept his word and instituted the proclamation.
Okay, I hadn't heard of that one.
Yeah, so some people still celebrate January 1st. Here, I'm in Kentucky, and in Tennessee, August 8th is a date that's often celebrated.
Okay.
And
what is that? Yeah, what is that? Yeah.
Yeah, well, there's different stories of it. August 8th was actually important to the Haitian Revolution.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And it was a day that, then enslaved people and free Black people in the United States observed. And so there's some thought that that's kind of what explains it today. There's some other thought that, freedom came to Tennessee. It's a long, complicated story, but that there was an important moment in Tennessee's freedom struggle during the war on August 8th. Kentucky, though, because it was exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation, everybody wasn't free in Kentucky until 8 months after the Civil War ended. And that was December 1865 with the 13th Amendment.
And that's because what now? Why is that?
So if you were in an area exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation,
I got you.
The war ends and you're still viewed as enslaved. So it would take a constitutional amendment to make sure freedom was universal for everybody.
Do they celebrate the end of the war? Is there celebrations there? I'm not talking about just enslaved, but everybody. How does that go down?
Not so much here in Kentucky, and I don't think the end of the war, the final days of the war, have been a very big celebration. I mean, celebrating the Appomattox, peace. Yeah. That's never really been. It's more like Memorial Day. Historically, was kind of the day for people to come together, Black and white, although they would often do it separately, to recognize Civil War veterans and.
Okay, I got you. Yeah, I see that. Yeah, I see that. Is there a question that I haven't asked you? I don't know all of them for you about your book. Some that you cover that would be, quite interesting. I know it's all interesting, but something else.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I could talk a little bit more about, what it was like to live in some of these camps during the war. And
yeah,
I guess I'll share is, what happened is, people would come into Union Army lines and just start kind of carving out a space. And the Army was supposed to provide them with tents and some shelter. But as I mentioned, that didn't always happen. But they would start building. And so in some places, small villages emerged during the war, Black villages with churches, schools.
Really?
Yeah, because I mean, that was one of the first things so many wanted was schooling and reading and writing. Missionaries came down, Black and white missionaries from the North came down and would work and help with the schools. And so in some places you start to see what looks like a new small town. One example, I'll just tell this little story, is in Northern Virginia, in Arlington, which was originally the land of Robert E. Lee, that came into the Union's possession early in the war. and became the site of one of these refugee camps, although it really developed with houses and churches and schools and a park and roads and everything, that it became known as Freedmen's Village.
Okay, I've heard. Yep, I heard of it. Yep. Yep.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
And so that is one example. There were more here in Kentucky on Hilton Head Island.
Oh, sure. Okay.
And so forth.
Yeah.
And some of them lasted, but one of the story is not like a progressive story of progress.
Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah.
And the end of the war is actually an end to a lot of things. It's not just an end to combat, but what happens is the Union Army demobilizes, starts to go home.
Yeah.
And the US government, particularly after Lincoln is assassinated.
Right.
And Andrew Johnson comes in and he's far more conciliatory to the white South.
Yeah.
What happens is that a lot of these camps turned villages, and I've counted over 300 of them, they are on lands that before the war belonged to white Southerners.
Yes.
And what they do is they mobilize to start figuring out, how are we going to buy this land, or how are we going to rent this land?
You mean the black people or
the Black people?
Okay.
Yeah, they want to keep, if they're building something that looks like a village and a town, they want this to stay. This is the future.
Right.
And so they start pooling money to try to figure out how to purchase land. They start consulting lawyers. They start having public meetings about this. But to make a long story short, Andrew Johnson orders that the land needs to be given back to its Confederate owners, ex-Confederate owners.
Yeah.
And as no big surprise, they're not exactly excited to sell their land to a new black town or black village.
Yeah.
So what happens, unfortunately, is that many of the people living in these places have to leave, and their homes are destroyed, in fact.
Yeah.
And so this, means that the loss that comes at the end of the war is really compounded for them. Because they've got to kind of start all over again now.
Yeah, I got you. Yeah, I heard about that. Yeah. Well, do you have a copy of your book there that you can show us?
Right there. And this actually is a photograph. This is Camp Nelson, Kentucky, one of those villages I was talking about.
Oh, sure.
All those houses were built during the war.
Okay. It's available on Amazon, and
it is on Amazon. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and other bookstores too. It's published by UNC Press if anybody wants to buy it from them. Okay.
Well, do you have a website of some sort that?
I do. I need to update it, but it's amymerletaylor.com. Kind of a long URL, but my 3 names.
Okay. Well, hey, I thank you so very much for coming on Strong Inspirations and giving us another perspective of what happened.
Thank you so much for having me. Yes. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you so much, everybody. You see what I do on the channel? I find the people, they tell it to you. I just asked a question, and I was thinking, what kind of questions can I answer? Because she was telling it herself, and I just tried to chime in because, I know a little bit of something. And, it really enlightens. It really kind of goes with my keyword strong. Those people were resilient.
Absolutely. And persistent. And
tenacious. And all that good stuff. And so everybody, come on, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button on this video for sure, because it's good. Tell somebody about Strong Inspirations. I thank you so very much for being on the channel and taking time out of your busy schedule to share this information with me and the viewers. And I say to you, I want you to stay strong, stay safe, stay on your grind. We really appreciate you. Again, everybody go out and get her book. You'll be enlightened even further. And so we're out. Bye-bye. Have a good day.
Thank you.